being Jewish, I often say that I bear the weight of all the history of the Jewish people, um, including the Holocaust. And the reason for my saying that is if you think about Judaism, you think about our holidays, the major ones, Passover, Hanukkah, Purim. We tell stories of the near destruction of the Jewish people in ancient times, and are constantly reminded of what might have been. Yet I might have been born into a family that spoke German or Polish or Russian instead of Yiddish, and that lived in a different place with a different history and with different stories that would become just as meaningful to me. There have been many Holocausts throughout history. The African slave trade is estimated to have resulted in perhaps as many as 17 million deaths. The genocide in the Belgian Congo, also called the Rubber Terror, was responsible for somewhere between 1.5 and 13 million deaths. The Armenian genocide is believed to have cost between 650,000 and 1.5 million people their lives. It seems hubris to refer to one Holocaust as the Holocaust, although perhaps that's not so far off the mark as people might think. Each of these crimes against humanity continues to be meaningful to the people involved. And so today we're going to explore one Holocaust that has been omitted from our histories, what was done to the German people after the Second World War. So that being said, that's the topic that I'm going to address. Let me comment on what this isn't. It isn't an attempt to justify what happened after World War II because of what happened during the war, nor is it an attempt to say that because Germany bears responsibility for the Holocaust, punishment should not have been meted out on the German people. Jews in particular should always reject the idea of collective guilt, but there was no question that Germany was going to suffer after the war. It's just that for many of us, I'd say most of us, we don't know the extent or the degree of that suffering. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind is a quote attributed to Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi. The horror of the Holocaust is not that it deviated from human norms. The horror is that it didn't. What happened may happen again to others, not necessarily Jews, perpetrated by others, not necessarily Germans. We are all possible victims, possible perpetrators, possible bystanders. That's from Yehuda Bauer from a book called Rethinking the Holocaust. So during the war, the Western powers, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States had held a number of conferences. You've probably seen pictures of FDR, Churchill, and Stalin all sitting together. In February of 1945 at Yalta, Stalin had been promised that he might exact reparations of kind from the Axis powers. And what those reparations would be managed but locally by each of the victorious powers. So France would make up its own mind, England would make up its own mind, and Russia would make up its own mind what they wanted in terms of reparations. To describe the meetings as tense was an understatement. Britain and the United States feared a Europe dominated by Stalin's Soviet Union. The Soviets, in turn, believed that the Westerners did not appreciate the sacrifices, the horrific losses that they had endured. They had, after all, borne the brunt of the Nazi invasion and defeated the largest part of the German army. Military losses suffered by the Soviets are estimated to be between 8.8 and 11 million. Civilian deaths at close to 15 million. More than 10% of the country's population had been killed. Moreover, the majority of the country's infrastructure had been destroyed. Almost immediately after the end of the war, the Soviets conscripted 700,000 German men and women, both POWs and civilians, to work in labor camps. The conditions on the transports and at the camps were so terrible that approximately 270,000 of the deportees died. But that's only a small part of what was going to continue to happen. The Soviet Union ultimately used several million Germans in forced labor. Most were released in 1953. Some were held until 1956. While most of those swept up by the Soviets were Germans, they also included Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Jews in Budapest and would also be imprisoned. In 2000, Russia acknowledged that he had been imprisoned by them for 2.5 years as a socially dangerous person and then would be executed in 1947. Raoul Wallenberg is one of those remembered as being a righteous Gentile. If you think back to the causes of World War II, of how it began, you will recall that Hitler used the term Lebensraum, or space for life. It was an important component of the Nazi creed. The German people needed space to expand and more natural resources than Germany itself could provide. Hitler said, "We are overpopulated and cannot feed ourselves from our own resources." Germany and the German people first expanded into Austria, announcing a union or Anschluss of the two countries. Then Hitler pressed for the incorporation of the Sudetenland, that portion of Czechoslovakia that was already home to 3 million ethnic Germans, 1/4 of the total population of Czechoslovakia. Even prior to World War II, there were ethnic Germans throughout Europe. In the aftermath of the war, all of this would be reversed. In what might well be the largest forced migration in human history, between 12 and 14 million German-speaking civilians would be forced to leave their homes in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Poland. At least 500,000 of those exiled died. Estimates vary between 500,000 and maybe 2 million. During this relocation operation as the result of starvation, disease, or maltreatment. Here is one personal account. The screams that rang through the darkened cattle car crammed with deportees as it jolted across the icy Polish countryside 5 nights before Christmas were Dr. Locke's only means of locating his patient. The doctor, formerly chief medical examiner of a large urban hospital, now found himself clambering over piles of baggage, fellow passengers, and the buckets that were given to them to be used as toilets, only to find his path blocked by an old woman who ignored his requests to move aside. On closer examination, he discovered that she had frozen to death. Finally, he reached the source of the screams, a pregnant woman who had gone into premature labor and was hemorrhaging profusely. When he attempted to move her from where she lay into a more comfortable position, he found that she was frozen to the floor with her own blood. Other than temporarily staunching the bleeding, Locke was unable to do anything to help her, and he never learned whether she lived or died. When the train made its first stop after more than 4 days in transit, 16 frost-covered corpses were pulled from the wagons before the remaining deportees were put back on board to continue their journey. A further 42 passengers would later succumb to the effects of their ordeal, among them the doctor's wife. The source is from an article entitled "The European Atrocity You Never Heard About," published in the Chronicle. I can go on about the conditions that German-speaking, and I'm being precise when I use the word German-speaking, as in many cases, like today's dreamers in the United States, they thought of themselves as citizens of the countries in which they had resided all their lives and countries they were born in, experienced after the war. Suffice to say that they would be familiar to any Jewish Holocaust survivor. They were stripped of their poverty and rights, sent to labor camps, or deported, sometimes in the same cattle cars that had been used to haul people to the concentration camps. The use of forced labor was not confined to Eastern European countries. And I want to be clear, not to blame only the Russians. Approximately 750,000 German POWs were used as forced labor by the French, and there were numerous allegations of starvation. In the October 12, 1945 issue of the New Yorker, conditions in French POW camps were compared to Dachau. Many of these soldiers had been turned over to the French by the Americans. General George Patton, a man not known for being a snowflake, wrote in his diary, "I'm also opposed to sending POWs to work as slaves in foreign lands, in particular to France, where many will be starved to death." Patton would later write to the president and ask to be reassigned. He just couldn't take it anymore. So, what's the point that I'm trying to make here? I'm not trying to be subtle or evasive. I want to be really clear. What I hope you'll get from this is very simple. Hatred breeds hatred. Violence breeds violence. In particular, Jews must reject the concept of collective guilt, if for no other reason than that is what forms the theoretical basis of all anti-Semitism. It isn't good for anybody. One of my major life inspirations has been a man that I was never lucky enough to meet, someone who is known to me only through his interviews and the writing of his biographers. I mean Simon Wiesenthal. Wiesenthal exemplified the values of compassion, understanding, and tolerance. Before I turn things over to my friend Jeff, the founding director of Beyond Barriers and a consultant for the Simon Wiesenthal Institute, let me leave you, Simon Wiesenthal Center, let me leave you with this quote. "I don't think that there's any other solution than constantly coming to terms with the past and learning from it. There is no point in minimizing guilt in order to make it easier for sons and daughters to bear the failure of their fathers and grandfathers, their mothers and grandmothers." That's one of the reasons why I have so much respect and admiration for Simon Wiesenthal and for those like Jeff who continue his good work. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you for sharing all that, Larry. That was an incredible history. And I think the lesson, first and foremost, one of the lessons that I take away from this is war is hell. And there's really no victors when it comes to it. And one of the things that I would like to share is some very personal stories that I haven't really shared a lot with the public from my own family history. And when you were talking about the train cars there, it resonated exactly with the story that I'm about to tell. So my mother and grandparents came over from Germany after the war. And so I'd be second generation American. And we grew up in our household. My grandparents and my mother would speak German, so we would hear that, and we learned a little bit of German growing up. And my curiosity and fascination was with that part of the family history. So I was always asking questions growing up, and wanting to hear from my grandfather, excuse me, stories about the war and things that happened, and different things of that nature. And a little bit of background on that. My grandmother and her family were from Prussia. So after the war, they lost their homes. They were that land there was given over to Poland after the war, and she was on one of those train cars, the same train cars that the Jews were put on and brought to concentration camps in. And one of the stories that my grandmother had shared with me was about the starvation. You already covered that as well, but she said she was packed into a train car when they were being moved out of Prussia and thrown out of their homes. And they were passing a chicken leg or a turkey leg around the train car because there was no food. And she said most of the people in the train car were gnawing on this chicken bone. And, so I had asked, I said, did you, and she says, no, I couldn't bring myself to do that, she says, but that's how hungry we were. That's where we were at as a people. And just a couple years before she passed away, and I didn't even know this until more recently, I always assumed that train car went back into Germany. And what I found out just a few years ago, just a couple years before she passed away, was that her and her sister, my aunt, my great aunt, they were sent to Italy in a camp there, a refugee camp, because there was nowhere to go in Germany for the family. My great uncles, my grandmother's brothers, and my opa, my grandfather, they fought in the German army. One, my uncle Hardo was captured at Stalingrad, and 500,000 Germans were captured. I think 500,000 lost their lives there, and about 90,000 had surrendered when Stalingrad was completely surrounded. Of those 91,000 soldiers, only 5 to 6,000 lived. The rest were worked and starved to death in Soviet concentration camps or prisoner war camps, work camps, whatever you want to call it. My uncle was with the last group of German prisoners to have gotten out of there alive. When he came home, he weighed about 90 pounds. He was barely alive. And these are some of the stories and things that I had heard growing up. My other great uncle, was injured in the Ardennes offensive, and I'd met him. He was still there in Germany. I'd met him when I was 15, and talk about war being hell. I said, well, how am I going to recognize him? Because there wasn't very many pictures in our family. When I went to Germany when I was 15, I said, how am I going to find my uncle? He doesn't speak a word of English. How am I going to find him at the airport? And my mother says, you look for the man with the burned off face. And that's how I found him in the airport. Because he had gotten blown up in the Ardennes offensive by the Allied forces in that battle as well. So he was wounded. My grandfather was in a Allied prisoner of war camp, and then the other great uncle was, captured by the Soviets. And so I grew up hearing stories like that. It wasn't something that they wanted to talk about, and I put it on myself. I mean, I was a curious young kid. I was interested in history. I was interested in that family history. And unfortunately, as everybody knows, I got involved in Nazism, National Socialism, joined the National Socialist movement, and was involved in that for 25 plus years. So what's interesting about some of those stories and different things like that, and a lot of the Germans that I knew other Germans and families that had been involved in it as well. And a lot of people would talk about not wanting to, and my grandfather said this as well. He said their worst fear was getting captured by the Russians, that the Russians would rape the women. And I say the Russians, the Soviets, whatever you want to call them, but that there was a lot of atrocities that were going on all different sides. So, I'm hearing these stories growing up, and it was nothing positive that came out of it, but it made me really angry. And, hearing about those things, and I felt like it was a sense of a justice, I guess you could say, to get involved and be involved in the movement. And, it was obviously, it was a bad path. It was something that that I shouldn't have never been involved in. But knowing that family history, and what's interesting, since I left the movement and been working with the Wiesenthal Center, been working with Beyond Barriers in the Jewish community, because I didn't know people in the Jewish community before. And I vilified them and dehumanized them because that was the so-called enemy. That was who was blamed, not by my family, but in the movement. The Jewish people were blamed for many, many things. And it must have been their fault, type of thing was how I thought growing up. So knowing these things and understanding these things, it wasn't good for me. And it was really interesting, Larry, when I was talking with a Jewish friend of mine, and we were talking about generational trauma, which is something I didn't know about when I was involved in the movement, but I know about it. I learned about it after getting out and hearing, especially about families that have been through the Holocaust, how it affects the next generations, how it's affected them when they've heard things from their grandparents and or parents, and it's passed down through the generation. Even if it's not really discussed, it becomes like this fascination or this curiosity. And a Jewish friend of mine had said to me, she goes, Jeff, I think you have generational trauma. And I said, no, I don't think so. She goes, no, I think so, because of, hearing those stories or learning those stories growing up, similar to, and she had generational trauma. And I found it very interesting. I don't know if it's the case or not, but I thought it was something interesting that I would want to share with everybody, because hearing those stories growing up and learning about those things, I always felt like this sense of anger about it, that it was unfair, that it was, terrible. And I didn't look at it from the way one should look at it, from a fair sense of justice on these scales. I just looked at it from the side of, well, that's the side my family was on. Um, Even though my dad's family, now they didn't fight on the US side, but they were Americans. So I could have identified with that, but for whatever reason, I gravitated towards that German side of the family and that history and that story and those stories. And I felt angry about it. And I felt like, perhaps, getting involved was a way to atone for that, and to reach some sort of justice. Obviously, it didn't do that, but that's the psychological aspects of it, and it can affect people for many years. And you hear, like with a lot of in the African American communities, generational trauma from slavery, and hearing the stories of that nature passed on. So I thought that was something that interesting that I would like to share. And it's kind of a controversial subject because it's not something that people like to talk about, these kind of things that happen after wars, and the starving of people, and it's just it's so negative on every single side. If there's anything that someone can take away from this discussion, or from learning about this forbidden history that we're talking about, is basically that this is where war ends up, and it doesn't just affect the generations and the people that were involved in it, but it's passed on, and it can be passed on. And I would say, and I'd like your thoughts on this as well, Larry, but the generational trauma, I've seen it through so many of the Jewish people that I know that experience it, and I think it's a really real thing, and I wouldn't have believed it 10 years ago. I wouldn't have believed it. Now I feel like I see it. I've talked with people that have been through it, and I think it's a real thing, and I think it's that's my opinion on it. But I'm curious on your thoughts as well.
There's no question that it's real. It's certainly been documented that the children of survivors often felt guilt that their parents had gone through this terrible thing, and they were leading normal lives. But I want to talk about a couple of things on that, Jeff. I wonder whether, had this history not been forbidden, not been forgotten, not been lost, had this been something that was discussed, that said, this is what happened after the war, and reach a kind of happy ending, that arguably, Germany is probably the country that has dealt best with what was done during World War II, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But had the best way to disinfect anything is with sunlight. You can't stop anything from festering by putting it under a rock. Talking about generational trauma, and one of the things that, so people know that I'm in the games industry, that I work for a company that makes games. The publishing partner for our title System Shock is a company based out of Germany, large company, PlayOn, formerly known as Koch Media. I work with people from PlayOn every day. I mean, we have a business relationship. When I mentioned to my contacts over there that I was doing this presentation, I was shocked by the number of people that told me, yes, my mother was on one of those trains. Yes, my father survived the Soviet labor camps. Yes, my parents, this happened to me. It's something immediate. Just last week or the week before, was the commemoration of the Tulsa riot, the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's something that I hadn't realized, and Jeff, I'm not sure that you were aware of it. The 3 survivors of that day are still alive. The thing that shocked me most was the man of the group, who was only 2-3 years old at the time that this happened, was wearing a U.S. Army veteran's cap. I don't know his background, but I'm going to assume, as I would if I saw somebody wearing a veteran's cap walking down the street, that he had served, and we should be grateful for his service. But I'm thinking to myself, he saw what we did, what we as Americans did 100 years ago. He saw that, and he went on as an adult man to say, "How can I best serve this country?" I mean, I'm just shocked by that at the amount of loyalty that still remains there. So there's no question to me, Jeff, that the trauma and also discovering these secret truths, these things that are buried that you find out about because it happened to people in your family, but you don't see in any of the history books that you're reading. You don't see television shows about it. That you become to think, well, if they lied to me about this, what else did they lie to me about? And
Yeah.
that opens things up. It's unfortunate, but I don't want to go down the road of conspiracy theories, but just as violence begetting violence, lies beget other lies. You were probably primed for the materials that the NSM gave you, as in the early days when you were being recruited, because you had just learned that things that you knew to be true, most people around you didn't know. So when they come to you and tell you about the Zionist occupying government, when they tell you about that, it makes sense to you. Well, maybe there are
It
these
fits
other
it starts fitting your narrative. It's a confirmation bias. It's
Yes.
exactly what it is. And I'm glad you brought up Wall Street. I was just there actually in Tulsa and went to the museum there, that covers all that stuff, and went and seen Black Wall Street and learned about the history there. And that museum is only been there for just 2-3 years, I think. It's fairly new. It's fairly new, and that is another a part of American, very dark part of American history that a lot of people don't know about, and it was horrific learning about that, and it was very difficult to see that. And so these are very uncomfortable subjects that we're talking about, and in that history. And you're right, it is hearing about that, and then all of a sudden, and that's how the brain works, especially on confirmation bias. You go, well, if they're and that's just it. If they're lying about this, what else are they lying about? And it opens up that door for conspiracy theories, and you just fall right into that trap. So as anyone that's listening to this, to be vigilant for that, no matter what you're involved in. It doesn't have to just be extremism, but any type of thinking. If you are blind to other opinions, or being open to other things, you can quickly fall into that trap of confirmation bias.
That's that whole red pill, red pill theory, right? That this movement, that these people are going to show you a reality that most people don't know. We as mainstream people, and I'm going to discuss a little bit about. I mean, your background is well known, but I'm going to discuss a little bit about my background, about the antidotes to extremism, if I may. But we as Americans have got to confront our past. But that it doesn't have to be all negative. It doesn't have to be. I always start off my classes by saying that people are people. If there is one great truth, it's that. It's that people are people, and that you have some good people, some bad people. I start off my classes on Jewish history by saying, look, everybody wants to be famous by relationship, right? You want to claim Albert Einstein. Maybe you want to claim Sigmund Freud. Maybe not so much Sigmund Freud. You want to take credit for the good people, right? But you also get Bernie Madoff. You get Jeffrey Epstein. It's a package deal, right? When you get the good and you get the bad. It's not to make anyone feel bad. It's not to make anybody feel particularly good about themselves, right? It's just what is. That the propensity for good and evil is equally distributed, and we forget that sometimes. I always discuss that there's two Americas, and there always have been. There's the America that happened, and it was like all of us, imperfect and flawed. And then there's the America that we aspire to, and that's really what's important. You can teach both of those things. You can accept that, yes, we did give Native Americans blankets from people who had died from smallpox. We did that intentionally. And that was a terrible thing that we did. We've also been the country that helped rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan. Certainly, the countries that we fought against in World War II, Germany and Japan, as well as Italy, they're all thriving economies. So does that happen, Jeff? And I don't know if you're aware of it, but Lords from Beyond Barriers did a test with me a number of years ago, a personality test. I was to be patient zero. I was to be the person that didn't go into extremist movements. And I've told you my story when I was a teenager, the bombings and the things that one associates with the 60s and 70s. My life certainly took a left turn right after Kent State. That was something that really changed me. Why didn't I go into an extremist movement? Why didn't I join the Weather Underground or another similar group? And I'll tell you in one word. I'll explain it to you. Hope. I knew that there was a better future waiting for me. Now, look, I didn't come from a wealthy family. I grew up at 1184 Walton Avenue in the Bronx. It was not, I was not born with what's the line from the song Substitute? I was born with a plastic spoon in my mouth, wasn't a silver spoon. So, but I always felt that there was something better waiting for me. And if you look at people, at extremists, if you look at people, in particular terrorists, what is absent from their lives and from their cultures is hope. You think to the Middle East, what would it take to get you to strap on a vest full of explosives that you knew you weren't coming back from? Well, you have to think that yes, there's paradise waiting for you on the other side, but on the other hand, you have to be convinced that this life is not so great and won't get any better. And if you give people, if you want to prevent those kinds of things from happening, the key thing that you have to give people is hope that tomorrow can be better than today.
Really well stated, and that's it 100%. That's it 100%. Is and a lot of the people that are involved in extremism, and that's a perfect example of like the people that are strapping bombs on themselves and doing these terrible things, they've lost all hope. And if we want to look at negative things in society, we can stay stuck on that all day, and you can be angry and ticked off all the time, and that's exactly what happens. And that's what happens in these extremist movements. I can tell you that I was a very angry person when I was involved in that, because I was focusing on those bad things all the time. Right. I was focusing on the atrocities that happened, whether it was, some criminal activity, or whether it was something else that happened where white people were victimized, and then we'd find those things. There's a million other stories. For every bad thing that happens, there's 1,000 good things that happen. There's a million good things that happen. But if you stay focused on those negatives, and we all know people like this too in life. And I came across a few of these people, like people that were really depressed, and it didn't matter what was going on. They would always find something negative. We all know those people too. We all know at least one person in our life that's like that, where you're talking about something and it's even a good thing, and they go, well, but that part sucked, or just they have to say something negative, and you go, man, I know I have a hard time being around people like that, because I can take it for a few hours or take it for a while, but after a while, it just constant negativity and feeding back into constant negativity, it's hard because it brings you down. It brings everybody around them, that down as well. So it is about having hope, and it is about the way you frame things, and it's about the way you look at the world. If you look at there's bad things that happen in the world, and there's bad people in every group. And there's also really good people in every group. And if we have to constantly focus on the bad, it's not going to be good for us. And I also want to say, to the audience, anybody that's out there that has questions for Larry and I, please pop them in the I don't even know what you call it here. The question,
our Q&A area, area. Yeah. I'll also add one other thing. For people that are listening, I mean, Jeff, the work that you do is absolutely amazing, and it's certainly admirable. You know of my admiration for you on that. Let me just also say that as I approach my retirement stage, what at least I've started thinking about that. It's a couple of years away, but it's on the horizon. I like to say that like many products, I have a limited shelf life. I was asked what I'd like to do afterwards, and quite seriously, I said I'm going to go back to prison. In 1977, 1978, I worked at a maximum security psych facility for youth offenders in New York, and that's something that really really, it was very difficult. I was injured more than once on the job. It was a dangerous job, but my feeling is we as a society can't afford to write off the any portion of our population. It's generational. So when you send somebody to prison, you're also sentencing his children to a life impacted by prison. So that's something that I'd like to pursue in my next stage. If anybody's looking for somebody to go out and speak to people in prisons, I tell Jewish congregations that I work with, it's pretty easy for me to convince them that anti-Semitism is bad. It's the guy with the 1488 tattoo on his face that I need to reach. He's the one that I need to change his mind. And I do believe that change is possible, and that we can all evolve. Again, one of the things that's striking, and I don't know, Jeff, I don't know the last time or when you were back in Germany, but one of the things that I went last year for the second time, and I'll be going again later this summer. One of the things that's always striking to me about Germany is that the signs commemorating the things that happened there, they don't mince words. You won't see a sign that says 500 Jews 500 Jews died here. You will see a sign that says 500 Jews were murdered here. It's the acceptance of that, and I think that acceptance has really been key for Germany's ability to move on past their past, to accept it and to grapple with it, and to be able to move on to the next phase. Again, the people that I work with in Germany, I mean, they know that I'm doing this presentation, and almost universally they were supportive of it. But the stories, the stories are, as a Jew hearing these stories, they sound exactly like the stories of the Holocaust survivors, of the concentration camp survivors that I've heard. There's so much to that, and
that's a good point too, Larry. And I've been, I'm still a little nervous when I tell my story about the family history, because it was just something that even when I was in the movement, I didn't tell a lot of people. When my grandparents were still alive, and there was this, like fear that, well, what if someone accuses them of being camp guards or something like that when they're here in the United States? That was a very real fear. And, it was things of that nature. But you're right. And we have to come to terms with these things in history and tackle them and be honest about them. And what I found that's really fascinating, and I think a lot of people, anybody especially that's on the fence or that's involved in the movement or anything like that, that's thinking about these things, they probably think, I know I thought it when I was involved, that the Jewish people would, come after us, or that they were going to be so terrible, and all that. And Simon Wiesenthal, even, and I don't have the quote in front of me, and I don't want to butcher it, but he had said something about not revenge but justice.
Justice.
Yes, and it was about, the people that had done the atrocities and things like that, but it wasn't to punish the people. And what's really interesting, I guess what I'm trying to get at is when I have started telling my story and sharing it with people, especially with Jewish audiences, for some reason I always thought, like, they do not want to hear this. I shouldn't share it. Maybe I shouldn't share this today. And what I found, which is surprising, which was, it's not surprising anymore, but it was surprising at first, was they did want to hear about that. They did want to hear and share their stories. So I've shared my story about the family and things like that with probably more Jewish people than anybody else, and they want to hear about it, and they're curious about it. Which brings me to another point. Another friend of mine by the name of Tamara, she participates in something where and her mother's a Holocaust survivor, and she's still alive as well. But Tamara goes over to Germany, and her family was also from Prussia, so we had that in common as well. And gets together with people from the other side, Germans that had committed, crimes or different things like that, or people,
Their families, right?
the families, bringing the families together for dialogue and to talk about these things. And wow, that is an incredible healing opportunity. And it's just like those reconciliation commissions that they've done in Cambodia and
Rwanda. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yep.
Again, there's nothing magical about it, but the best way to cleanse that stuff is by exposing it to the daylight, by talking about it, not hiding it, and accepting it, and using the word we. Yeah, well, I'm an old man, but I wasn't around then. But it is our responsibility. We as Americans did Tulsa. We as Americans, and it's the same way that we need to embrace our triumphs. We need to embrace our failures. Um, I've been fortunate enough. I have two wonderful children. They're both aware of their father's flaws as well as his virtues. I mean, I make no bones about that. I am human, and I make mistakes, sometimes terrible, costly mistakes. Um, and all you can do is pick yourself up, recognize that you've done it, and try to move forward. Jeff, I don't know if you've ever heard this, or if I've ever said this to you, but um, the thing about admitting your mistakes, if you don't admit your mistakes, you can never get past them. If you don't acknowledge the things that you've done, you carry that burden forever. And you've been really great. You've certainly been a role model on acceptance and moving beyond where you were. And I think your story is not only a great story. I think it's a very, very American story. That if there's one quality that we in America should be really proud of, it's our willingness to give second chances.
Thank you. Yeah, second chances. It's not easy for me to say, but I feel like I've been given a second chance. I mean, here, look at, I was the head of the NSM for 25 years, and now today I'm a consultant and public speaker with the Wiesenthal Center. That to me, that just every time I say it, it blows me away. But that's what being an American is all about. It's about second chances. It's about righting the wrongs, and we can do that. This is something that we can all do. Everybody can come back from things, and no one is above reproach. We've all done stupid things in our lives. Some of us did it for 25 years, unfortunately. That's a personal jab at myself, but some of us made mistakes here and there, and some of us have done worse. But it's all about taking ownership of that, fixing and repairing righting the wrongs, and moving forward and keeping positive. keeping positive, because if you do stay negative and always focus on the negative things, it's hard to move beyond that.
We've got a question about Scott Adams, the cartoonist, and their statement. I'm not sure. Could you tell us what the statement is that you're referring to? Would you mind putting that in? People might not be familiar with the Scott Adams recent remarks. Otherwise, I will. I'll quickly do a search and see. I just want to make sure that I quote it adequately. And so, again, it depends on who you look at, but this is from CBS News. So Scott Adams. So let me see if I can grab this quote. So I'll pop this into the channel, and yeah. So again, this is from CBS News, and I'm going to say that this is accurate, but I do not say that they're being fair in terms of their context. After that, Scott Adams, he recently said that he lost 80% of his income after making that statement, that he was blacklisted, so to speak, for making that, which is kind of an ironic use of that word. I see kind of two sides, and Jeff, I want to give you a chance to respond on that also, because the issue of cancel culture. I mean, we've talked about that before. I believe that one of the ways that we can vote, and I don't mean vote in terms of an electoral process, but I mean that we can vote is with our pocketbooks, with our wallets. If somebody says something that I don't like, or if somebody seems wrong to me, and I don't mean that they're wrong about a topic, but they're the wrong kind of person, I don't need to spend my money on them. That should not be a requirement. On the other hand, you know, the sense of let's all form a mob and go after somebody without necessarily reading the full context of it or seeing what they said. That's something that is social, is a byproduct of social media. In the old days, you know, a mob could only form in your town, right? Now you can form a mob on Twitter, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and you know, and launch what are attacks there. I see both sides of it. I should not be forced to buy a product from somebody that I don't like. I shouldn't be forced to do business with a company that I don't appreciate their values. You know, there are many instances that I can cite of you know, where it at least appears that a company, I'm not going to attack people, but where a company is doing a bad thing, right? British Petroleum, with the massive oil spill that they couldn't control. Well, you know, that seemed like a bad thing. There was this monster of oil floating off the coast of Louisiana. Um, Maybe I choose to go to Shell instead of BP to fill up my car with gas. Um, Maybe you don't like Elon Musk, and so you don't buy a Tesla. You buy a nice American Chevy Bolt or a Nissan Leaf. You buy an alternative. Um, I think that those are fair things, and I think that sometimes by calling it cancel culture, as opposed to I don't have to support people that I don't like. I think that makes it seem like it's something new. We've always done that, right? There've always been companies that um, my dad wasn't too happy with the Kennedys. It's really funny about JFK and RFK. But my dad going back before then, because their dad was one of the people that kind of broke embargo and sold liquor to Nazi Germany. I'm not going to say he's right, or I'm not going to say he's wrong. There were a lot of companies that supported the Nazis and broke embargo because they saw there was good money there. Um, but I think labeling it cancel culture makes it seem like it's something new, and it's really not. Jeff, might have a different opinion on that one.
I think I'm pretty much the same on that. I don't know who Scott Adams is, or I'm not really familiar with that in particular. So I hate to comment on something that I don't have a full grasp on. But I'm not a fan of cancel culture. I'm pro free speech. I think that we should be able to talk things out and have dialogue in this country. And but just like Larry said, if you don't like a product or whatever the product is pushing, boycott it. Don't buy it. You don't have, you don't, or don't look at it. Don't, if you don't like, they're trying to cancel different comedians and stuff. You don't like a comedian because he says something that is offensive. Don't watch him. You don't have to get out there and make a big deal out of it and try to get the guy to, or the lady to lose their career over it or anything like that. Sometimes people say stupid things too, and it shouldn't damage you for the rest of your life. I mean, that's kind of my, I may be biased on this, but I just think that everybody says stupid things sometimes as well. I'm not a fan of cancel culture, that's for sure.
Right. Let's just. I think both of us were really perhaps a little bit uninformed about this, but here's the statement that we're being asked to respond to. The cartoonist who for many years did a cartoon about Dilbert, which was great cartoon about office workers and computer geeks. The cartoonist responded to a Rasmussen report poll about whether it's okay to be white, which stated that 53% of African Americans agreed with the phrase. However, Adams focused on the ones in disagreement and labeled African Americans as a hate group. That there was that, but again, Scott didn't stop there. He also suggested that all white people get the hell away from black people, which takes us back to, I mean, we know how that goes. I know my life, but I also know that Daryl Davis was an enormous force in your life, and Daryl is somebody that is certainly deserving of admiration. And the thing with Daryl is that Daryl really helps bring people together. Well, you have a more personal relationship. I mean, tell me, am I spot on that he helps bring people together rather than to divide them?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Daryl is one of the best in the world at bringing people together like that. And that's just the thing that goes back to what we were saying earlier about labeling and about throwing people inside of a box. Black people are bad because they disagree with this, or white people are bad because they disagree with this. I mean, this doesn't make any sense when you break it all down, because it's not groupthink. That's not how the world works. That's not how humanity works. Sure, there's some people that think that sort of thing, and I would say they're wrong. We can all get along. We all have more in common than we do differences. And the people that are doing that, you talk about, there's inequalities in society and things like that. It was just not too many years ago where we were told not to see the color of each other's skin, and we should look at each other as, or Martin Luther King said it best, in my opinion, where he said, a man should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And I'm 100% behind that. Nowadays, you've got a lot of people that want to make everything about race. I've even heard this, and this is coming, and maybe this is too controversial, but this is coming from the left, where they're saying, you've got to see blackness, you've got to see whiteness, and it's all about race again. To me, I'll tell you what, it reminds me of being in the movement. That reminds me of the Klan. That reminds me of Nazis. Because if you're focusing on everything and looking at it through the lens of race, what is it? Figure it out for yourself, where you stand on it. That's up to the individual. But for me, when I hear that kind of talk, it brings me back to when I was in the movement, and that's what it makes me think of when I hear people talking like that. So, and that's something Daryl Davis doesn't talk like that. He talks about bringing people together. We're not supposed to, of course, we're going to see he's black, he's white, he's brown, but really, is that what matters? That doesn't make the person, the pigment in their skin. I mean, come on, that's just like saying every plumber is fits in this box, or every electrician fits in this box. It just doesn't make sense. And if we're looking and viewing one another that way, that's not very American in my opinion. And that's dividing, and then it's causing problems. And then it's, once again, it's bringing us back to this very negative place where we're judging one another based on superficial things like skin color, and it goes nowhere good. That's my opinion.
There's a fine line between patriotism and nationalism. There's a fine line between self-worth, pride, and supremacy, right? It's one thing to say being black is good. It's great to say being white is good. The problem comes up when you say being white is better than being black, or being black is better than being white. And in terms of seeing things and that, I think that we're past the point where, here's an interesting bit for you. The term "the melting pot" comes from a play that was written by a man named Israel Zangwill, a Jew who had fled Russia when they banned the Jewish theater, gone to England, and then came over to America. The first night that his play, The Melting Pot, opened, the president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, stood up and said, "That's a damn fine play." So it's just funny that the term "the melting pot" was coined by a Jew who recent immigrant to America. That said, when we had the idea of the melting pot means that whatever color you go in, you kind of come out this mixed beige color, right? That you lose all sense of who you are. I think what the people on the left, and it's a poor communication of the message, is that, Jeff, you should be able to stand up and say, I come from a German family and I'm proud of my roots. And that I should be able to stand up and say, I come from a Jewish family and I'm proud of my roots. And somebody from Thailand should be able to say, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But again, it's that fine difference between, as I say, nationalism and patriotism.
It's a great point. I want to just share one thing real quick, because
Sure.
I thought about it when we were talking about Daryl Davis, and this was something that Daryl had said. I think it was in one of the talks that him and I had together, and I thought this was a really interesting way of looking at things. And Daryl's full of these quotes; they just flow out of him like nothing. But when we were talking about white pride, black pride, all these pride things, and there's nothing wrong with that. And someone's proud of their race, great. There's nothing wrong with it. But the way Daryl put it was so interesting, because he says, when someone says to me, that they're proud of their race, they're proud of what they've accomplished. He goes, I think about pride, and pride is something that, like, I've accomplished. Like if I won the race, or if I won a competition, he goes, I'm proud of that because I won that, or I accomplished that. It's an accomplishment. He goes, the skin color we were born in wasn't our choice.
It's an accident of birth.
Yeah. Like you said, accident of birth, right? Exactly.
I also think about this. If you're a grown man and all you got is your whiteness, your blackness, your yellowness, or your Jewishness to be proud of, you probably haven't done a whole lot in your life.
That's it. That's it. That's where I was going with that.
You might need to rethink that position.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting close to the end of our time, and I would like your permission to leave our audience with a thought from a German who is somebody that is a personal hero of mine. Martin Niemöller was a prominent Lutheran pastor in Germany. In the 1920s and the early 1930s, he sympathized with many Nazi ideas and supported radically right-wing political movements. But after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Niemöller became an outspoken critic of Hitler's interference in the Protestant church. He spent the last 8 years of Nazi rule from 1937 to 1945 in Nazi prisons and in concentration camps himself. He's perhaps most famous for this, which is usually done in the form of a poem. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Thank you all very much for attending. Jeff, Casey, thank you so much for having me as a guest. I truly appreciate this.
Thank you, Larry. It was great having you again, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and a great presentation. Thanks to everybody that joined us and everybody that's watching this later on YouTube or on one of the other platforms. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you learned something from Beyond Barriers. Good night.